All right, so welcome. Today we're going to be focusing on modules 27 through 28. And I'm starting here with the picture that was actually on the last slide, but now that you have both classical and operant conditioning, at least a little bit of context for them, I think that this picture will make more sense. Okay, so the thing to remember is that classical conditioning associates an involuntary response with the stimulus. Okay, so for instance, with Pavlov's dog, the involuntary response was the dog salivating after he was classically conditioned to associate the ringing of the bell with getting fed. In operant conditioning, we're talking more about voluntary behavior as it relates to a consequence. And perhaps you remember reading about the Skinner box, where the rat pressed a lever for food, and that's what's indicative here in this picture. Both want food, but both have different associations based on the way that they were conditioned. Pavlov's dog, it was an involuntary response. The rat learned the consequence of pressing a lever would lead to food. Okay, so let's dive into operant conditioning. So while Pavlov and Watson are the guys that you probably now associate with classical conditioning, B.F. Skinner is kind of the behaviorist that we want you to associate with operant conditioning. And this doesn't sound controversial, believing that external influences, not our inner thoughts and feelings, shape behavior. That might not seem controversial, but it really was at the time. I think so often we like to think of us as humans being just so rational, and that our behavior can be explained because we have intellect and morals. And B.F. Skinner was kind of thought that we are a little bit more basic in that, that it's really the stuff happening to us from the outside in that shapes our behavior. Okay, so B.F. Skinner, know he's associated with operant conditioning, and know that like Watson and Pavlov, he was a leading behaviorist theorist. All right, so operant conditioning, here's a definition. It's a type of learning in which a behavior becomes more likely to recur if followed by a reinforcer. That's a really important word here, a reinforcer. Or it becomes less likely if it's followed by a punishment. Okay, so reinforcers always seek to increase a specific behavior, while a punishment seeks to lessen that behavior. And another word for that is the law of effect. And that is when behaviors become more or less likely depending on the consequence. Okay, the picture in this slide is of a man named Brandon McMillan. He comes from a family, a pretty famous family who trains animals for movies. I want to say he trained the tiger in The Hangover, and he, at some point in his life, actually stopped training big animals for movies and now trains service dogs. And I think that if you've ever had a puppy or have a dog that you've trained, I think operant conditioning will make a lot of sense, especially if you've had a very younger sibling or an animal that you can think about training. So, operant conditioning, all about reinforcers or punishments, okay? Let's first talk about reinforcement. Reinforcement is any event that strengthens the behavior that it follows, okay? So reinforcers are always seeking to increase or strengthen a behavior. Here's where it gets tricky. There's positive reinforcement and there's negative reinforcement. Negative does not mean bad. This is going to be really important to remember with these modules. Negative reinforcement is still always a good thing. It always seeks to increase a behavior, okay? So let's do an example, okay? A student, a kid, he comes home with his grades. He's been struggling at school, and let's say he studied just really hard for the spelling test and he gets an A on it, right? Mom and dad are thrilled. If they want to positively reinforce him, they would give their child something that the kid really wants. They'd let him have ice cream. They'd let him pick the restaurant they were going to go eat at. Okay, so it's positive in that it's giving him something that he wants. Negative reinforcement is taking away something that that kid does not want, okay? So for instance, kid comes home with the spelling test with 100%, negative reinforcement would be saying, okay, you don't have to do any of your chores this weekend. They take away something that the kid did not want to do anyway. Okay, so reinforcement always seeks to increase behavior, whether it's positive or negative. Do not associate negative with bad. Associate it with taking away a behavior or a thing that somebody doesn't want. Okay? Another word for this is called shaping. This process could be called shaping, which reinforcers guide behavior toward closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior. So this is not something that happens overnight. The struggling student is not going to get 100% on his test and be a straight A student after that. But over time, with more and more success, the kid is likely to become a better student if mom, dad, whoever keep reinforcing that behavior. On the flip side of reinforcement is punishment. Okay, we've all probably been punished at some point in our lives, either at home or at school, etc. So punishment is an event that tends to decrease the behavior that follows. Okay, so let's take the school example. A student who keeps talking out of turn, the teacher keeps getting upset and trying to kind of course correct for that student. Eventually, if that student keeps talking, the teacher will likely punish that student. Okay, so two types of punishment, just like there's two types of reinforcement. There's positive punishment, meaning that you are giving that student something to do that they don't want, or you are taking away from that student something that they do want. So in this case of the talking too much student, positive punishment would be the teacher making you write lines on the board saying, I will not talk in class 100 times. I'm not sure that this is a thing anymore that people do, but it's kind of a classic example. That's giving the student something that they don't want in order to decrease the behavior. Or another thing might be taking recess away from that student. Okay, that's negative punishment. You're taking it away in hopes that that student is not going to talk in class so that they don't do it the next time. Okay, just as a little FYI, reinforcement works better than punishment. Okay, so if you are training a puppy, it is much more powerful to praise that puppy for doing something good than to punish it for doing something bad. Maybe you can even tell your parents this the next time you do something bad and they want to give you a punishment. You can remind them as an AP Psych student that they should perhaps be reinforcing your good behavior rather than punishing you over the behavior that they don't like. So here's a chart that I find particularly helpful to describe positive and negative reinforcement and or punishment. Okay, so remember, when you hear positive, don't think good. When you hear negative, don't think bad. When you think positive, it's an addition of a stimulus. Negative is the removal of a stimulus. Okay, reinforcement is something that you do to increase behavior, whereas punishment is something that you do to decrease behavior. Okay, so check this out. I even recommend copying it down in your notes. Let's quickly run some examples, okay? Diana has a new puppy that she's house training. Whenever her puppy has an accident, she gently brings the dog over and says no. However, when the puppy sits by the door to indicate it needs to go out, Diana gives the dog lots of praise and a treat. In this case, Diana is using what? Okay, well, here we see that she is giving the dog something. Okay, so we know right away it's going to be positive blank. Is it punishment or reinforcement? Okay, Diana giving the dog praise and a treat is likely to reinforce the dog going to the door when it needs to use the bathroom. Okay, so in this example, we have positive reinforcement. In example number 2, David loves his mother's apple pie. However, she only makes it a few times a year because it's so labor intensive. This time, when David's mother makes pie, David offers to help and afterwards does all of the dishes on his own. Okay, so this one's pretty complicated. So let's kind of take a look at this. So you might think that David is adding something to himself, but David is actually trying to manipulate the behavior of his mom so that she'll make more pies. Okay, so what David has done is he removed something that his mom probably doesn't want to do, because making these pies is just so much darn work that David taking away some of the work is likely to have her make more pies. Okay, so in this case, David is negatively reinforcing his mom to make more pies. Negative because he's taking away the chore of doing all of the dishes and reinforcing that he wants her to make more. All right, Fanny's brother often teases her anytime she loses at a game. After playing and losing a heated game of Candyland, Fanny's brother starts to tease her. In retaliation, Fanny starts screeching through the house and banging pots and pans in order to get him to stop, okay? In this case, what operant conditioning tactic is Fanny using? In this case, Fanny is trying to stop a behavior. So in this case, we know that it's punishment, okay? So, is she positively punishing her brother or negatively punishing her brother? Well, by adding in the screeching, running through the house, and banging the pots and pans, she's adding a negative stimulus. Okay, so in this case, she's positively punishing her brother. In this case, unlike the others, Fanny wants a particular behavior to stop. In example number 1, Diana wants the puppy to keep going to the door, so she's reinforcing it. David wants his mother to keep creating apple pie, or to keep making apple pie, so he is reinforcing that. Whereas here, Fanny's just straight up punishing her brother because she does not want to be made fun of anymore. All right, so let's talk about the operant conditioning schedules, okay? If you are on a fixed ratio conditioning schedule, this is reinforcement after a number of desired responses, okay? So let's take Starbucks for instance, okay? You collect stars on your little Starbucks app. This is a fixed ratio system where after, let's say, 10 drinks, you get a free one. So they can't condition you every time you buy something at Starbucks, but if it's on a fixed ratio, every 10 you get a free thing, that is another way of conditioning somebody, since they can't reward you every single time. You might see this as well in terms of punishment. For instance, losing your license after 5 tickets. Okay, it's not going to happen every time, but every so often there's going to be a reward or a consequence. On the other hand, there's a variable ratio conditioning schedule, which is reinforcement after an unpredictable number of responses. Once again, we cannot reward somebody every time they do something good. But let's say, for instance, your parents let you pick your favorite restaurant sometimes after you clean the house, okay? They can't do that probably every single week, but they can do it sometimes. Playing the lottery is also a variable ratio kind of conditioning schedule, okay? You're gonna play a bunch of times, you know, you may or may not get rewarded for it, okay? But still knowing that that's a possibility is still powerful. Okay, so there's ratio conditioning having to do with a number of times something happens, and then there's an interval sort of ratio, forget it. There is an interval schedule, meaning that every so often based on time rather than number, you would be conditioned. So in a fixed interval system, reinforcement schedule happens after a specified time. So if you show up to work every day, every 2 weeks you get a paycheck, okay? Or fixed interval would be anticipating that you have a quiz every week, and you're gonna get feedback on that based on how you do. Variable interval is when the reinforcement schedule that happens after a specified time, okay? So there's no necessarily set number of times to do something, but every so often there might be something that conditions a specific response. So winning at a video game or checking your phone a bunch of times to see if you have likes. It won't happen every time you do it, but sometimes it will. I tend to think that these do get a little confusing, so I would recommend that you come up with your own examples, but I think that this little chart here is also very important to put in your notes, okay? When it's fixed, it's constant or consistent. For instance, the Starbucks, every 10 drinks you get a drink, okay? That's a fixed kind of standard. Variable means that it changes, okay? Maybe every 5th time you clean the house, maybe every 3rd time you clean the house, maybe every 100th time you play the lotto, something is going to happen. If it's a ratio thing, it's a number. It's associated with a number versus an interval system is all about time. Okay, I do, like I said, I think that this could be a little confusing, so I'll ask you guys to come up with a few of your own examples in your notes. Okay, let's just go back here. So let's just go back here for a second. Okay, when it's fixed, it's happening at a set time or number of times something happens. Every 2 weeks you get a paycheck. Every 10 drinks you get a free one. Versus something that's variable, you don't exactly know. How many times do I have to clean the house to get to pick to go to my favorite restaurant? I don't know. How many times do I have to check my phone to see if I got a bunch of likes on that Instagram post I just did? It's unknown, but I know that eventually it's likely to happen. Okay, so do look at these, try to get comfortable with them, and do kind of come up with your own scenarios. That way, you know, you would be comfortable answering on a test if I gave you a specific example of what kind of schedule some type of reinforcer is on. Finally, this is also in the book, very important here to understand the difference between operant and classical conditioning. This is kind of the essence of these last few modules. They're both types of learning. Kind of going back here really quick to the beginning. Classical conditioning really has to do with an involuntary response, whereas operant conditioning is a voluntary behavior that's learned based on the consequence of those actions. Okay, so I know this is a lot, but I think you guys are going to do good. I'm going to have you guys kind of create your own examples, just like we did with classical conditioning, to really make sure we get this down. All right, so thanks for watching.